As we mentioned, First Lady Melania Trump was back at our southern border today, this time without the clothing controversy that marred her last trip. And this time she visited two different locations in Arizona. She did offer her support at migrant facilities in both Tucson and Phoenix.
I know how dangerous and difficult your daily jobs are, so I really appreciate all you do in the behalf of the country. I wanted to come here and see your facility and meet the children, and I want to thank all of you for what you do, and I'm here to support you, and let me know what I can do to help you.
Meanwhile, the fight over her husband's family separation policy rages on. Demonstrations were held today in Arizona, Texas, Wisconsin, Washington, D.C. to condemn the Trump administration's so-called zero-tolerance policy. Inside the huge Hart Senate office building in Washington, almost 600 protesters were arrested. Some of them wrapped themselves in those silver runner's blankets that we've seen used for the children at the border. Those arrested included a Democratic member of the House from Washington State and the actress Susan Sarandon. The protests are continuing as the controversy has actually worsened. An HHS official today said the total number of migrant kids in custody is actually up from last week. That's despite a federal court order late Tuesday that requires migrant families be reunited within 14 to 30 days, depending on age. Well, with us from El Paso County, Texas tonight is our own Cal Perry. Cal, I'm told we're fighting a bit of a satellite delay, but my first question for you is this. Is the federal government any better equipped tonight than when you first got out there to, for example, reunite toddler A, who happens to be in a Michigan shelter, with family A, who may be in McAllen, Texas?
I think they're probably worse equipped because family A may not be in McAllen, Texas anymore. They may be back in Guatemala. The other thing is there's a paperwork issue sneaking up on everybody. The U.S. government loves its paperwork, and they love it in duplicate. And if you're born in a rural hospital in Guatemala and your mother presents that birth certificate here to officials while you're trying to get to your child in some kind of tent city, it's quite likely they're going to reject that paperwork. They're not going to accept that birth certificate. So I think the U.S. government is actually worse off than they were when this policy was implemented. They were vastly unprepared to handle the child separations. They were even more unprepared to handle the situation when we started moving around those tender-aged children. That's when we saw the creation of these tent cities and these beds and the discussion about perhaps moving folks onto military bases. So no, I don't think they're any better off than they were a week ago, Brian.
And Cal, what personal reporting do you have on the stories we've seen emerge that they've taken something off of the absolute zero tolerance policy at the border, that it's not being enforced as much or as effectively?
Right. So what we're seeing here is a continuation of the immigration system overwhelming the courts, really. When you go into these courts and you see people come in groups and you see them plead in groups and then you see them leave, you realize that the system wasn't great before, but it's worse now. And while they may not be separating families at the border, and we've heard really awful anecdotal stories about ICE agents basically doing duck, duck, goose down a line where they're pulling kids away from their parents and putting them in these tent facilities. And while that may not be happening anymore, we don't know what the federal government is doing when they're still separating these kids, when they say that the parent is a danger to the child, because they're doing it without showing us. They're moving these kids around at night. They're keeping them in facilities that we don't have access to. And when you start down that road, when you start putting kids in vans and sending them down a road at 3 in the morning, trying to hide them from the media, everything else becomes nefarious. So when you say to me that the number has actually risen, which we know that it has, I don't know if the government is making a good faith effort to try and stop separating families, or if they're just finding a loophole in the law that says if the parent is a danger to the child, they can still separate out the child, Brian.
We have sure appreciated your reporting from out there, Cal Perry. We really appreciate you joining us from El Paso County, Texas.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.